So for our next speaker, I have the honor of introducing Joe Corvetti. He is a partner with Deloitte and one of the founders of our emission solutions team. He has recently taken on the new role of coaching 11-year-olds playing basketball when he's not working hard for his clients in challenging how we're looking at carbon and the future of our world with technology. Today he's going to speak to us about emerging technologies in decarbonization and passionate with resources and infrastructure as we make decisions in technology. So over to you, Joe. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So look, a slightly different take, I guess, on climate and sustainability now. Macro, kind of bigger picture, the good news is there are solutions on the horizon, and so I'll take you through some of those. I'll quickly touch on us, what we do, some of the background and basics around power generation and energy sector and some of the dynamics around that. I think we might touch on offshore wind, hydrogen and carbon capture, which also can get a bit of a bad rap at times, and then some of the nature-based work that we do. So Deloitte, a broad climate and sustainability capability, building, growing every day. Emission solutions came into the climate and sustainability practice earlier this year, and there are three founding partners of that practice, Marnie Oaten, Suren Thuraraja and myself, and we're gradually building out a team there. But quite a big global capability within Deloitte, solving lots of very complex problems. I'll try to touch on some of that complexity without being too overwhelming, I guess, because there is a lot to cover. When we look at the carbon, the carbon equation, I guess our overall goals are obviously to reduce CO2 and any greenhouse gas emissions. CO2 is not the only one. Minimise waste, get to a nature-positive solution. And when we look at it, we tend to focus on three areas. So transition technologies that can have an impact, so we're actually not emitting CO2 at all if we're using wind and solar, etc. We look at nature-based solutions and how can we work in a more nature-positive way and leverage, I guess, what's naturally available. Circular economy, really we're trying to limit emissions there and reuse, recycle. Today's presentation is really on the first one, transition technologies, so we'll look at those in a bit more detail. 2020, International Energy Agency published a piece of work, Net Zero by 2050, which I thought might be interesting for today, given that some of the themes of that report are still carrying through today. We do require huge leaps in clean energy innovation. You know, if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, it shows you that to achieve some of our goals by 2030, 10-15% of the technologies are still under development. If you look at what we need to achieve 2050, nearly 50% of the technologies are still under development. So there's a lot of work to be done around developing robust, efficient technologies that are not only carbon neutral, but as I say, nature positive as well, if possible. Transition to net zero is about people as well. So within Deloitte, we do a lot of work around just transition. Unparalleled clean energy investment boom will lift global economic growth. There's no doubt about that as we transition to wind and solar, there's huge economic benefits. The energy sector will be dominated by renewables in the future. How quickly we can get to that, well, that's up to all of us at the end of the day. And I'll talk a little bit about some of our buying habits. New energy security concerns emerge. We only have to look at the situation in Ukraine and Russia, and you know, some of that energy security is certainly creating some level of instability around the world with gas prices and energy prices in general. So it impacts all of us. You know, one of the more controversial statements by IEA was no need for any new fossil fuel supply in the net zero pathway. I guess that is being tested pretty hard at the moment around maintaining energy security in different parts of the world. So when you look at the bottom right curve, you see that two of the trends that stand out, we expect to see GDP growth in the order of 40+%. As we transition to renewable fuels, we also expect to see electricity generation. A lot of that is obviously IT, transport and stationary power generation are the big things that will drive, and that, electrification is really what we're talking about, moving away from coal and gas and moving to renewable forms of power. So wind power is something I thought it was worth touching on. Onshore and offshore wind. Onshore wind is pretty well established in most parts of the world. It has been in Australia for some time. We do have lower capacity factors onshore. It's not as efficient as being offshore. NIMBY, the not in my backyard phenomenon, still exists very much to this day. And some of the onshore wind projects are certainly challenged, and solar projects challenged by this. So working in a conservative, a nature-positive way, developing climate resilience and the aesthetics associated with onshore wind can all present some level of challenge. What's emerging, however, is an offshore wind sector in Australia, which is quite exciting. My background is oil and gas and energy, done a lot of work in big offshore structures. And so looking at large offshore wind installations just seems entirely sensible to me. If you've ever been in Bass Strait, you know what I mean. The wind blows almost 24/7. Less established certainly in Australia, but emerging in the Northern Hemisphere, and we're taking learnings from there and bringing those into Australia. Much higher capacity factors offshore in certain parts. The Blue Economy CRC did a really interesting piece of work showing how good and how strong the offshore wind resource is in Australia. So we do see there's huge potential there. NIMBY, is it an issue? It's less of an issue if you can get out offshore, particularly over the horizon and people can't see it from the beach. I think that's terrific. Some of the early developments you might see from the beach. And again, conservation, climate resilience, can we develop co-benefits? Can we grow seaweed farms around offshore wind farms? These are really interesting concepts that are being looked at and studied at the moment. So as I said earlier, there are solutions emerging and there is a lot of work being done in this space. The history of offshore wind in Australia is a relatively short one. So we start, back in sort of 2016, 2017, race forward to 2021 and we had the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act passed by Parliament. So now we're sort of off to the races and able to seriously look at offshore installations. The first areas will be declared, looks like Gippsland will be one of the first ones to get off to a development phase. Star of the South is one of the projects that's been sitting in the background for quite some time now, which we expect will see a lot more attention. So there are things happening and it's all pretty good. In terms of the sectors that will use particularly offshore wind and look to more electrification, obviously transport, energy and resources are hungry for more electrification, particularly the mining sector, green steel, green manufacturing, modern manufacturing, all looking at large-scale electrification where possible. Aluminium smelting, hydrogen production. I'll talk a little bit more about hydrogen, but that definitely needs, the ironic thing about hydrogen production is you need energy to create hydrogen, which I will talk a little bit more about now. So hydrogen as an emissions-free alternative fuel is certainly on the landscape. It's there, you hear it, it's in the papers most days. Potential uses, certainly rail and road, heavy vehicle transport, mining sector looking very, very closely at hydrogen production at a large scale. It can be used for electricity generation, so the reverse of the electrolysis process which creates the hydrogen is a fuel cell which then creates electricity. And the agriculture sector also looking pretty heavily. So heavy industrial applications, I think IT sector, mostly it'll be electrification. Essentially it's grid-based power. Some of the emerging off-grid solutions are also very interesting, but largely it's grid-based. Lots of advantages in using hydrogen. Price will come down. $2 per kilogram is the sort of target price. Diesel emissions, we use a lot of diesel in Australia. That's just a fact. We have for a long time, and we will continue to for some time while we maintain, extractive and other industries. And there really is not much of an alternative at this stage. As for moving to hydrogen, yes, there are pros and cons, but there are some significant advantages when you look at emissions reduction, and it is a viable alternative. Recently, Deloitte did a piece of work with the University of New South Wales, the high supply chain piece here, and I think some of the themes that came out of that were areas like policy regulation and social acceptance certainly need a lot of work around the hydrogen sector. Leadership, co-investment, I think getting private sector and government on board will certainly help accelerate hydrogen acceptance. Infrastructure, co-location, so existing infrastructure should be used where possible in early stages. Proximity to ports, renewable energy, there's a lot of discussion around export of hydrogen, and it can be exported in different forms. Commercial viability, certainly some challenges there. Willingness or unwillingness to pay for off-takers to pay the price necessary. But Australia does have huge potential to be a hydrogen export country. Technology uncertainty, there is still a lot of development to be done. I think back to the IEA graph, some of that is around hydrogen and carbon capture and storage and other technologies. But certainly technology development is a key in making hydrogen a successful emissions-free alternative. Capability and timeline, I think, there's no time like the present, right? And people are certainly investing. When you look at the map on the right, this was also out of that same piece of work, a summary of all the hydrogen technology clusters around the country. You can see there's a hydrogen technology cluster in most locations, including, I think, 3 or 4 in Victoria. We work closely with the Clayton Hydrogen Technology Cluster, and we have a number of projects under development there. So I can say confidently that there is a lot happening in the hydrogen space across the country. Some of those clusters and technologies will be more successful than others, but where electrification is certainly not possible or not feasible, hydrogen does offer a reasonable alternative, okay? Perhaps just a word on carbon capture and utilisation and storage. Carbon capture has had a mixed, pathway over the last 10 to 15 years. People like me who have been in the oil and gas industry for some time and across the energy sector have seen CCS for decades, actually. Carbon capture and storage has been used for a long time in enhanced oil recovery. So it is possible, it is a feasible technology. The 3 areas, when we look at CCS, we tend to break it into 3 areas. So direct air capture, probably the least efficient, where you're taking CO2 molecules out of atmosphere. Now, the concentration of CO2 in atmosphere is about 400 parts per million. It's pretty low. And so running a large DAC system, and you would have seen some of those, I think, a number of IT companies have invested in direct air capture technologies at Climeworks and others. It is not the most efficient way of capturing CO2 out of atmosphere, but it can be done. And if you've got a sensible, practical storage location, then it can be done efficiently, and Climeworks, I think, have demonstrated that. Pre-combustion and post-combustion capture are, as they say, when you're burning gas, or in particular gas, you have a certain CO2 content. You can take that CO2 out of the gas stream, pre-combustion, or you can capture it post-combustion. Now, a lot of the CO2 projects around the world tend to be pre-combustion. There is some post-combustion CO2 as well, but once you capture the CO2, you've got to do something with it, and that's where the next challenge emerges. Storing it underground is not necessarily the only answer. There are other ways of converting CO2 into other useful alternatives, let's say, including blending in concrete and other things that are emerging as real real options for CO2 capture. Thanks. The graph on the right-hand side, again, is from the International Energy Agency. It's a couple of years old now, but shows that from 2010 through to 2021, you see a large spike in carbon capture and storage projects. Again, there is a lot of work being done in this space, as there is in hydrogen and wind. I haven't spoken much about solar and battery, but that is a more established area of renewable energy, okay? So CCS, certainly more there. Nature-based solutions, I'll just touch on this really quickly. We do a fair bit of work in this space. I think the graph on the left here shows a piece of work done by Deloitte recently. I'd like to credit, Guy Williams for this, and, showing that our business as usual curve here, which is the grey line, it doesn't put us in a very, very good position from a global biodiversity perspective. We do need to do more. We need to increase conservation, restoration efforts, and we need to transform production and consumption systems. So I won't go into the detail of this. This is not exactly my area, but I do like to point out that there is a lot of work and a lot of research being done in this space, but it is all about choices at the end of the day for a lot of us. Ocean-based carbon and ocean-derived carbon removal and negative emissions technologies are also emerging as viable options. This is related to a piece of work we did with the Blue Economy CRC, and shows various options for, growing large seaweed farms. What do you do with the seaweed? The seaweed will absorb a lot of CO2 in the creation of the biomass, and then what do you do with the seaweed once you've grown it? So there is a lot more work to be done here around the science of this, but it is becoming an accepted option, certainly in parts of Europe where the use of seaweed to develop fish proteins and other things there's a lot of exciting emerging options in that space. And we see a lot of interest in this in Australia as well. So what can you do? 3 things, I say: be curious, understand what your organisation's Scope 1 and 2 emissions are, what is the footprint, try to understand what Scope 3 is, which for a lot of oil and gas companies is the burning of the gas and the coal once it's exported. Scope 1 and 2 is more direct. Get involved, join your climate and sustainability team or steering committee or whatever you can do internally, add your voice and learn. As I say, be curious and make good choices at the end of the day. That's really the most important thing that you can do. I know it's not easy. When you look at EVs, for example, not the cheapest option, not the easiest option, but certainly it's satisfying to drive an electric vehicle with 0 emissions around the city, and it's quiet too. I think that's all for me. I'm happy to take some questions or anything from basketball to emissions reduction.
Perfect. Thank you, Joe. Yes.
Loved it. Great talk. I'm curious, I saw a number thrown out a few years ago that if we plant 1.2 trillion trees on the planet, we can, hit our 50% targets in order for carbon reduction. What are your opinions on planting trees or soil carbon for sequestering carbon?
I'll just restate that for people joining us remotely. So looking at tree planting and the future of that, what are your specific opinions around how that can impact goals and where we should be focusing?
Yeah. Look, when we look at all the nature-based solutions, I think it's a really good question. There's no easy answer, is the first thing I'll say. One of the main things that we consider when we look at nature-based solutions is not competing with food production. So if water is scarce and we need to make a choice, often the choice will be made around food production as opposed to CO2 reduction. Having said that, it's not the only option. So when we look at some of the biofuels, some of the crops that can be grown for biofuels are not necessarily competing with food. They're also quite efficient and sustainable. So I guess at the end of the day, it's again about choices, but also about being smart in the selection of crop, location, managing water, which can be a big issue, and people my age know who've been through various droughts over the years, that can be a significant problem in places like Australia. But we're blessed with, very great, great solar capacity, great offshore wind resource. So we really need to start using those as much as possible. But it's a very good question. I don't have all the answers though. So.
Yep, and one from the back.
Joe, so with the direct capture, and you mentioned at the moment it can be stuck underground, can you just elaborate on that? So in theory, it just sits there and may escape again?
So the question is, with direct carbon capture, when we put it underground, then what?
Yep. Great question. There's been a lot of work done in this space and for a long time. So there's a group here in Melbourne, Victoria actually, the CO2 CRC, that have been around for a long time, researching exactly this. A lot of their work is subsurface related. It's not necessarily the surface facilities, but looking at the reservoir and ensuring that leakage from CO2 capture is not possible. So it does come down to reservoir type and the formation type. So that's part of the skill at the end of the day, is using the subsurface skills that we have in this country, and a lot of that is based in exploration and production from deep gas and oil reservoirs, and ensuring that those reservoirs are able to store CO2 permanently. I'll say that the government just recently awarded a couple of CO2 exploration permits offshore, and so there is again a lot more being done in that space. But we do have, with Geoscience Australia and CO2 CRC, just to name two out of many, we do have a lot of knowledge in that space. And given my background in oil and gas, I feel comfortable that once it's put away, it's not coming back. But there's a lot of validation work to be done to make sure that doesn't happen. In some cases, though, there are special cases where I won't talk to the Climeworks solution, but that is a slightly different option to just storing it underground in a reservoir. But you can read about that. I think if you get on their website, you can read about how they store permanently and calcify the CO2. All right, I hope that helps.
Excellent, thank you. Any last ones? Yep.
Maybe one more. Just on your $2 a kilo figure about hydrogen, I was wondering, is that green, blue, brown? And secondarily, that gets in the media a lot. It's got a bit of some positive and negative reviews. What's your opinions on where will it end up? Will green, blue, which kind of level of hydrogen will we get to?
So the question is, on the $2 a kilo hydrogen, is it green, blue, red? What is it and where is it going?
Look, another good question. So I didn't really talk much about the different shades of hydrogen or the different colours. Blue hydrogen tends to be, or grey hydrogen even, tend to be produced often from methane gas. So we split the methane molecule and take the hydrogen away. Mainly what I was focused on there was really green hydrogen, and I think that is the target for the $2 a kilogram. But to do that, green hydrogen is basically defined as hydrogen that's generated or manufactured, created from electrolysis using renewable energy. So as long as the energy that's coming in to do the electrolysis is renewable. Now, there's been a lot of debate about whether $2 per kilogram is a reasonable target. You can do some reading around what it equates to, or its equivalent in comparison to things like natural gas or diesel from an energy perspective. And it would be very competitive if we got it to $2 a kilogram. There are not many projects that could achieve that at this stage, though. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.